Hello, my name is Jackie Bagwell, and I'm the Programme Director of the Exeter MBA. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to The Leading Edge, a speaker series brought to you from the University of Exeter Business School. A business school with leading research centres in entrepreneurship, circular economy, sustainable finance, simulation analytics modelling, and initiatives for the digital economy. It's also home to the Exeter Centre for Leadership, whose members conduct distinctive and high-quality research in leadership and governance. The Centre of Leadership also offers programs to undergraduates, postgraduates, and executive MBAs. Our intention in putting the Leading Edge together is that we develop a global community of leaders who are interested in what Exeter and its partners have to say about the ideas shaping business and society. We also seek to serve our regional economy by sharing with local leaders the thinkers who offer fresh perspectives to contemporary challenges. I'm delighted to introduce you to Kira Eastle, a Professor of Practice here at Exeter. Kira is responsible for the design and curation of the Leading Edge and launches us in a truly magnificent manner. Welcome.
Thank you, Jackie. Welcome everybody to the first in our series of Leading Edge talks brought to you by the Exeter MBA. And we're really delighted that you can join us this afternoon for Mapping an Uncertain Future with Margaret Heffernan. As Jackie says, my name is Kira Eastle. I'm a professor of practice here at the University of Exeter Business School, and I'm delighted to have curated this Leading Edge series. Now, we want this series to be a space where leaders have the chance to engage with the ideas at the forefront of positive change in business and society. And we've carefully chosen speakers with something provocative and challenging to offer so that all of you, our MBA students, our alumni, our academic and professional services staff, and our wider business community can gain new perspectives and inspiration for creating a better future. Now, through this series, we want to support our network of leaders, all of you, to connect with global thinkers who offer those fresh perspectives on the leadership challenges we're all facing at this time. And we want you to feel connected with us here at the MBA programme and with our Centre for Leadership. So if you have ideas on how we can support and connect with you, please do let us know. You can pick up our contact details from the chat. Before I introduce our speaker, just an outline of how the session will run this afternoon and how you can get involved. Please use the Q&A tab, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, to submit your questions to Margaret, and we will make our way through those after her talk. Jackie and I will be keeping an eye on the Q&A, and we'll pose as many questions as we can get through before we finish at 4:30. Do feel free to tweet. Our hashtag is The Leading Edge. And we're recording this session and we'll send you a link to the recording in the next few days so you can share it with interested friends and colleagues. So, with a desire to inspire and challenge you, I can't think of a better speaker than Margaret Heffernan, author, former CEO of several tech companies and experienced and acclaimed speaker. Now, Margaret's TED Talks, full TED Talks have been watched more than 12 million times, I worked out the other day. And I've been a fan of Margaret's since I heard her talking to Viv Groskop on her podcast, How to Own the Room. And I was really delighted when Margaret agreed to be our first speaker. She joins us from Bath, where she is Professor of Practice at the university there. And her latest book, Uncharted, How to Map the Future Together, was published at the end of February. A book with incredible foresight, or an author with incredible foresight. It includes a chapter on how to anticipate and respond to global pandemics. Now, what I love about Margaret's book is the feeling of hope and optimism, the encouragement that she gives all of us to get actively involved in making small changes and in our own agency as leaders and citizens. And I feel sure that she's going to inspire us this afternoon with both some big ideas and some prompts and some nudges for us all in thinking about what we can do in our own organisations and our communities to navigate the future together. So Margaret's going to spend the next 30 to 40 minutes talking to us, and after her talk we'll have around half an hour for questions and answers, and Becky and I will pop back up on your screens then and pose your questions. So over to you, Margaret.
Thanks so much, Kira, and thanks to everybody for joining today. Well, here we are, another day, another bunch of rules in a pandemic that we can't see the end of. We know we're also somewhere in the middle of an economic crisis, even if we're not quite sure where. We're surrounded by political volatility, and even before all this kicked off, we're already in a climate crisis. So what does the future hold? Nobody knows. Experts in forecasting say that if you're very open-minded, you consult a very, very broad and diverse range of sources. If you constantly tweak and adjust your forecast to new information and assign probability to that, then probably you can see with some accuracy, maybe 400 days out. 400 days. If, like the rest of us, you're not that rigorous and you're not that fastidious and you find probabilities a little counterintuitive, well, then you can see maybe with some accuracy, maybe 150 days. And even then, human life remains full of ineradicable uncertainty and events that no one can see coming. The story about what we should do now, what we shouldn't do, it's only ever going to be visible in the rearview mirror. And even then, we're going to argue about the conclusions. So in the meantime, we're here absolutely in it. And the transformation of business, which we've been talking about for so long, well, it's here now. And it feels strange. And I think it feels strange in part because it's not the way we ever imagined it, but also because I think there's a much bigger change going on than the change that we can see and feel and talk about all the time with regards to the epidemic. Because really fundamentally what's happened is that we've moved from a world that was complicated to one that's complex. And the differences are profound. A complicated world is linear, it's very well managed with efficiency, and it has patterns that repeat themselves. The three-legged stool of traditional management has always been forecast, plan, execute. But one of those legs is now broken. A complicated world may have thousands of moving pieces that we used to control fastidiously, like an assembly line. And we could feel in control and be actually in control. And we could plan. And we could achieve a lot through just-in-time processes. But now, thanks to globalization and pervasive communications, we're in a largely complex world. So yes, there are patterns, but they don't repeat themselves predictably. There are too many forces acting on too many forces, and it can feel like we're living in the middle of a 3D pinball machine where expertise really struggles to keep up and where very small things have a very large disproportionate impact. And in complex systems, the last thing that happened is almost never informative about what's coming next. So now we have to think about just in case. So the manufacturers of plastic straws couldn't plan or forecast the almost overnight obsolescence of their products. Producers of films and plays and TV shows and concerts couldn't plan for indefinite closure. Even though we know, and we have known for 40 years, that climate change is real, California, Oregon, Australia, Washington couldn't plan for the scale or pace of forest fires that they're experiencing today. This is what happens as we lose the power to predict. And the temptation is always to say, well, we just need more data. I've seen boards everywhere say this. When they don't know what to do, they call for more data. But data doesn't always solve the problem. Data can show us the reality around climate change, but it cannot predict specific fires, forest fires, or crop flooding. The Bank of England, I think quite boldly, has said, we know there are going to be bank crashes in the future. We just don't know where they're going to start, when they're going to start, or what the cause will be. In my book, Uncharted, as Kira reflected, I wrote a lot about epidemics, but not because I saw any of this coming. I absolutely did not. But because epidemics are the perfect image of what uncertainty really is, which is we have known forever that epidemics are with us forever. They are generally certain. But they're specifically ambiguous because there is no profile of an epidemic. Every single one is different. People who work in epidemics have this great sense of humor. This is their idea of a joke, which is, well, if you've seen one epidemic, you've seen one epidemic. We know they're going to happen. We don't know when. We don't know where they're going to start. And we don't know what the pathogen is going to be this time. That's kind of the heart and soul of uncertainty. And of course, the critical thing, and one reason why data won't always help us, uncertainty is about danger that's unquantifiable. Right? Risk is quantifiable. Uncertainty is not. And data alone is not going to solve all of our problems because specifically there is no data about the future. But I don't think, Kira's right. The book is quite optimistic. I am an optimist, even though it might not sound like that. I don't think that leaves us helpless. I think it means that we now need quite different kinds of organizations that are febrile in their sensitivity, that are highly alert and incredibly responsive to very small shifts in their ecosystem, profoundly aware of how every piece of that system works, and utterly focused on its health and well-being, which means that leadership can no longer focus only on the top. It really now has to be everywhere. And I think we've seen a kind of unconscious awareness of that at the beginning of the pandemic. Instinctively, most leaders knew that the first thing they had to do, above all else, was look after their people. And somewhat to their amazement, many found, wow, productivity went up, not down. That working from home, a practice that they had so long distrusted as a charter for slackers, actually paid off. And caring about people really worked. And by necessity, lots and lots of people had to move to quite small, quite ad hoc, quite local teams. Leaders have had no choice but to trust their people, to know what to do and to keep things moving. And what they keep finding is that absent the heavy hand of so-called scientific management, their workforce is full of really creative, really committed improvisers who are full of good ideas and who can act quickly, locally, because they're right where the action is. So the challenge for all of us right now, I think, given this explosive moment of learning, is how do we keep that going? Because there's always a gravitational pull to the norm. Phew, thank God that's over. Now we can go back to business as usual. I don't think so. Fantastic new research done by my colleague, Veronica Hope-Haley at the University of Bath, interviewed lots and lots of CEOs right through the crisis to add to her 10 years of research on trust. And what she found was that companies that went into the pandemic with high levels of trust in their leaders now enjoy higher levels of trust. So a great deal of trust has been fomented during this period. This is great. Trust makes everything work better, faster. But there are two real issues that stick out from this really incredible research. The first is that almost everybody's burned out. So this is a long-term issue which leaders are going to have to confront, even though they don't want to, because it's not like they have a B team sitting in the back room waiting to take over, but it's a real issue. And the second issue is that although everyone said, yes, trust in their leaders went up, they also said that they wanted to be kept better informed and they wanted to be able to be more knowledgeable. In other words, they wanted to be trusted with the information they need to do a better job. They have a lot more to offer, and they want the tools that they need to deliver. So in a future where creative responsiveness can make the difference between success and failure, informed participation is one way to address complexity and uncertainty. Now, I've seen some of this transition happen way before the pandemic. So, for example, I've done some work with the Bank of England, where the chief data officer knew that there was more and more data than ever, which was going to have to be processed. And because of increased regulatory demand, there was going to be a lot more pressure to analyze the data in more ways. And he was enough of a grown-up to know that, yes, the workload was going to increase, and no, the resources were not going to keep track of that increase. So what does he do? Well, traditionally, he would have taken his senior leadership team off to a swanky hotel for a long weekend, and they would have done a reorg, and they would have moved all the pieces around the chessboard, and they would have come back with a kind of new master plan and sort of hoped that it would somehow release additional capacity. And in this case, I think he thought, well, how do you know it will? And if it doesn't, then what? So instead, he did something really interesting, which is he explained the situation to everyone in his organization. And he said, so I don't know where the hidden pockets of productivity are. You probably do. So I would like to do a whole series of experiments, and I want ideas for experiments that might reveal some of this to come from anybody to me. And first of all, he was surprised by the number of suggestions that came in, and he was surprised by the quality of the thinking behind them. And they weren't just all linear, like, well, make everybody work harder. I know, let's do longer hours, right? Some of the experiments delivered absolutely nothing. Somebody suggested that, well, it would be helpful to be able to sit in on senior leadership team meetings to know what's going on and not have secrets. And what they discovered was, well, that takes a lot of time and it's quite boring. So the meetings were open, but over time people stopped coming. Another individual said, well, the appraisal process just stinks. It's really boring. Nobody believes a word of it. It takes thousands of hours every year. Let's redesign it top to tail as a much more interactive process. That, it turns out, was tremendous in terms of developing a process people believed in and that really energized people. And way, way, way down at the very bottom of the hierarchy, a whole handful of very junior engineers said, I think we could code the data differently. And if we did, we'd be able to parse it a lot faster. And they tried that with a bunch of sample data, and lo and behold, they had a 10x productivity increase. And as the chief data officer said to me, there's no way at the senior leadership team you would ever have known that. It's been well understood in management for a long time. There's always more information at the edge than the center. But the issue is, how do you get that information to travel to where it can solve the problems? The other thing I think we've seen along these lines is the rise over the last 10 years of open innovation platforms. Platforms where individuals and companies can publish very hard problems that everybody's tried to solve for a long time. Pharma does this quite a lot, as does biotech, and simply say, okay, anybody who wants to volunteer, have a go. And what's interesting is a whole bunch of things. First of all, how many people do want to volunteer? And secondly, that routinely the answers to these problems, because many of them are solved, the answers come from people working outside their domain expertise. So, for example, a problem about cleaning up oil spills came from an individual who's a cement engineer. Now, this isn't a cement problem, obviously, but it is about viscosity, as it turns out. And a cement engineer could reframe it and see a different way to address it. Equally, a problem to do with biomarkers for Lou Gehrig's disease, solved by a plant biologist. Of course, it's not a plant biology problem, but there was a way the plant biologist could see the problem that allowed him to identify a solution that the experts did not see. So there are a couple of things emerging from this. One is that asking for volunteers releases creative energy that's often trapped because people are sitting around waiting to be picked. They volunteer for the work that they're already interested in, that they do so for the joy of doing it and for the respect of their peers, and that you often get much better answers faster from places that you might not expect. In some parts of the world, we're also starting to see this kind of morph into what's called open strategy, which is involving the whole of an organization in thinking about and defining its future. So we've seen this in places like Virgin, Pixar, HSBC, Philips, quite a lot of German companies, which is quite a revolution for many of them. And it has lots of different flavors, from the simplest kind of crowdsourcing of ideas, which is essentially what was happening at the Bank of England, to significant and sustained collaboration. And part of what it's showing is that strategic thinking does not reside only at the top, but the point of engaging everyone in strategy is that it acknowledges the power of collective intelligence, that there is more knowledge at the edge than at the center, and that the best way to reap the rewards of diversity, if there is any, is more better insight from across the whole of the organization. It's faster and it's more accurate than bureaucracies. It can be constantly updated in real time. So right now I'm seeing this take a couple of new and different forms. Some companies have started putting younger people on their boards because they recognize that they're making decisions that will have impacts for generations to come, and feel some responsibility to hear from those who are going to have to carry the consequences of the decisions being made today. Others are creating shadow boards. So this is where you have a board that looks like the demographic of the society that you serve. So it has far greater gender, ethnic, sexual diversity. And it addresses the same problems, issues, challenges as the formal board, and advises the formal board on how they see these issues. These kinds of trends are really forcing a big rethink, partly because the pandemic has made us all see that our organizations, and indeed our lives, depend on the least visible and often the least rewarded in the workforce. So we better start listening to them. It's changed a lot of our thinking about where the value of work actually comes from. And we're having to think a lot about that because today, there's no point asking people to come back to work for the good of the business or the good of the economy if the business and the economy don't work for them. So this is a kind of new social contract we're having to think about. What's the deal? Is it a good deal? Is it a fair deal? As leaders, we now can't really escape having to consider the common good to which everyone is in our organizations might want to contribute. I think it's a trend that's just beginning. And I think as some of these other crises that I talked about at the beginning amplify, we're going to have to think about it a great deal more. In the transformation accelerated by the pandemic, I've worked with a lot of companies. Some were very small, some were startups, some were huge, some were new, some were old. They're across all sectors all over the world. And I would say that generally speaking, their response to this crisis has really fallen into two camps. So one group moved really quickly to get everybody settled, working from home and all that stuff, did that really well, and then kind of settled down into business as usual as far as they could. Obviously, lots of little subtle adjustments and stuff needed to be made, but they mostly stick to plan. Sometimes they had to rewrite the financial plan because revenues were going to be slower or smaller, but they didn't actually change very much. And I would say that my experience of working with these organizations is they're a little sad. They have quite a strong sense of what they've lost. I mean, not just in revenues, but somehow in terms of their identity. And they're very alert to the past of what they had, of what they don't have now. The others managed the working from home stuff really well too. Some of them found it easier because some of them had introduced flexible working anyway, much earlier. And they, and I would say in general, once they did that for everybody, then they took a big second step, which is they started to reconfigure the business. And they did that by saying, instead of just swapping bits in, right, cheaper people or whatever, they said, actually, let's see, what are our core assets? What are the things that make us important and relevant to the world? And how do we reconfigure those things now so that we accelerate out of the crisis and emerge more relevant, more future focused, and future ready? So how do we take advantage of this adaptability we've discovered and really amplify that? And if we benefited from public trust and support, what can we do now to amplify that? And if we were able to survive because of our suppliers or our communities, how do we really reinforce those links and support? And these companies, in my experience, are very, very much more energized. They have a much greater sense of agency, and they're very future focused. They want to come out of whatever crises they're going to have to go through stronger and better, and with greater support from the community that they serve and far higher levels of belief and commitment from their workforce. And I think that to keep all of that, because it's a lot of moving pieces in many places, to keep that coherent, the second group is having to deal with the dread word of purpose. Now, I'm always extremely reluctant to use this word because no sooner did it emerge into the kind of terrible jargon sphere of business speak than it got turned into meaningless nonsense. This is what always happens to business speak, right? For a brief shining moment, it has meaning, and then it gets kind of turned into something else. And, purpose, it quickly went to corp comms, and then it went into marketing, and now it means nothing. So you have purpose statements like helping Britain flourish. No idea what that means. But actually, if you're going to make this radical transition and accelerate out of crisis, to keep all of the changes you have to make coherent, you need a really strong sense of why you matter to the world. And it can't just be, what are we going to be for the next 3 years? I think it has to be, what are we going to be forever? Now, that's a big ask. It's a big test of, is this a purpose statement or a marketing tagline? So you need something also that is meaningful enough that it connects to people on a deep personal level. So that's why when Unilever moved to decouple growth from environmental degradation, Chief Executive Paul Pullman didn't just say that. And I mean, it is a fantastic purpose statement because It is meaningful forever. Growth must not come at the cost of environmental degradation. But he didn't just leave it there. He drove it down through programs that identified each individual's sense of purpose and how it connected to the larger purpose of the organization. He wanted to make the work personal. And that, he told me, is how he accelerated the firm's rate of innovation. And it's also how he made the firm rewarding for employees, for partners, for suppliers, and for shareholders. 300% return over 10 years. So what does this mean in practice? I think it means that we have to stop seeing the workforce as a cost and start seeing it as the source of value. Because after all, companies don't have ideas. Only people do. It means pushing work down as far as humanly possible to where the most local knowledge resides and where it's being seen live in real time. That means flattening the hierarchy. Nobody is an expert in the future because nobody has been there. So you need local knowledge and insight and decision-making to get better and better. If you trust them, they'll trust you. And it means seeing the ecosystem in which the firm resides and on which it depends. A complex network of your organization, your customers and suppliers, your partners and allies, and the society that you need to be robust if you're going to be robust. If the road system doesn't work, it doesn't matter that you're not in charge of roads, right? You still have to get your things delivered. So every company has a deep vested interest in the flourishing of a healthy society. Keep it healthy and you can thrive. And if it starts to wither, you will. It means you have to trust local leadership as a precious asset to be invested in. And that means being able to maintain real relationships of reciprocity, generosity, and trust across the board. That's how networks absorb and share information fast. And that's how you keep up to date with constantly shifting realities. If you like, this is sort of teamwork on steroids, right? Because for all that we've been talking about teamwork for decades, it's amazing how many organizations still really wrestle with it. So I've spent quite a bit of the last few years working with teams and working on teams and thinking about, so why is it that some of them are really great and some of them are, oh my God, they just give you, they make you lose the will to live. And of all the research that I've read on this subject, and there is a mountain of it, I think the best insight I've come across came from Tom Malone at MIT. And he did a beautiful experiment. I'm kind of a collector of beautiful experiments, where he brought in hundreds of people and he tested their IQ. And he saw, as everybody kind of knows, there is a rough correlation between IQ and problem solving. But now he put everybody into teams and gave them very, very complex problems to solve. And he saw what your experience would validate, I'm sure, which is some of the teams were great. Lots of solutions, lots of fantastic collaborative thinking, and other teams that couldn't even agree what the question meant. So the focus of this experiment, of course, is, so what are the characteristics of these fantastic teams? Well, the first thing that's really interesting is what isn't. So the very, very best teams were not the teams with the highest aggregate IQ. Putting all the smartest guys and gals in the room will not produce an outstanding team. Secondly, the great teams were not the ones with one or two IQ superstars. This notion that a few magical people will lift up everybody's performance, forget it. There were three characteristics that defined the really productive creative teams. The first was they scored really highly on a different test, a test called reading the mind in the eye test, which is roughly considered a test for empathy. This meant people stayed connected with each other. They cared about each other. They kind of stayed in touch with each other, often in a very unconscious, inchoate kind of way. The second thing was when they replayed the recordings of the problem-solving sessions, they found that in the best teams, roughly everybody contributed equally. Now, this wasn't a formal agreement, everybody gets 3.5 minutes. It just turned out that way. So they were getting kind of the full advantage of everybody's expertise and experience. And the third thing that they found was that the better teams had more women in them. And, they don't quite know what that means. Women typically score more highly on the reading the mind and the eye test. So maybe you're just doubling down on the empathy quotient, or maybe it's an element of diversity. In any case, what really matters, I think, about this research is that what it suggests is what matters most isn't so much the individuals as what is happening between them. Or to think of it another way, it's the mortar, maybe even more than the bricks, that makes an organization creative, intelligent, and resilient. And it's interesting because there's quite a nifty little parallel here with sociology, which has studied sociologists who've studied communities under extreme duress and pressure. And what they found was that, in a time, for example, of economic stress, you could see in the same neighborhood some streets that were really clean and safe and well looked after, and others that were just a disaster. They were dangerous, they were filthy, there was graffiti and rubbish everywhere. And they wondered, why are these two streets undergoing the same pressure with roughly the same demographic and population? Why are they so different in their response? And what they found was that, having looked for every possible factor of difference, the only thing that made the difference was that on the safe, clean streets, people knew each other. Now, they weren't each other's best friends. They weren't running in and out of each other's kitchens all day, but they knew each other enough to keep an eye out, to kind of pull a kid's bike in from the garden if it had been left out overnight by accident. They just kind of looked after each other. This is what we now call social capital. And what's really interesting is to think, if I think back to the Malone research, they repeated with virtual teams, exactly the same thing was true. They found all the same results. So the point here is that, the stuff that so many businesses were amazed to discover, wow, you look after people, all sorts of amazing, wonderful things happen. It's true on any level you care to examine it. Whether you're looking at it in data-driven experiments at MIT, whether you're looking at it in societies traumatized by economic or political breakdown, it remains the same point, which is that actually how you treat people determines how resilient your organization can be in the face of rapidly changing circumstances. Now, I don't kid myself that, just going out and being nice and convening a very broad range of people and listening to them and making more collective intelligence in an organization is simple, or that it isn't hard work. I've run companies myself. This is a very, very challenging job. And by the way, it's never over. But I also think that it's better work. I think it's better for an unpredictable world. I think it's better as a source of a firm's coherence and legitimacy. And I think it's better for people. Because you don't need me to tell you, we live in a very, very testing time where stress and anxiety and loneliness and grief are increasingly common. But I've also written about chief executives running their businesses through existential crises when they teetered on the brink of extinction. And these were really extraordinary, some of the most extraordinary interviews I've ever done in my life. I mean, not least because at some point, each of these CEOs wept just remembering what it had been like to go through this. And that was in itself so remarkable that I asked them, well, if just remembering this was so painful You know, I could only imagine what it was like actually to go through it. How on earth did you get through it? And they all said exactly the same thing to me. Well, it was my friends and my colleagues that got me through it. That when I couldn't take it anymore, they kind of shared the load. And when they couldn't take it anymore, I shared theirs. One added rather bitterly, it's pretty much the opposite of the gig economy. In an age of crisis, what gets people through is each other. We have many, many sources of resilience and robustness in our organizations. Sometimes it's core assets, sometimes it's intellectual property, sometimes it's raw materials, sometimes it's business relationships, and yes, it's always cash. But the pandemic has revealed a capacity for change and mutual support that managements worldwide, and I'd have to say management schools worldwide, have always underestimated. Success now consists of doing work that matters alongside people you care about and trust. Because for organizations to be healthy and resilient requires that their people are healthy and resilient too. I think these days and for the foreseeable future, uncertainty is the only certainty that we have. And in an age where so much is unpredictable, we have no choice but to build more and gain more from the collective intelligence and creativity of our people, to see them as sources of value, not cost, and to appreciate that the job of leaders is the same as it always was, to build value through building social capital, through participation, experimentation, by listening, and by paying attention. That's how you build an early learning system and a rich collaborative network of creativity and improvisation. The potential rewards for everyone are huge because the greater the participation in decision-making, the faster implementing change can be. You don't have to sell change to people who designed it. So it's fast, it's credible, and it's co-created by people who care. I think that's where we are. In some organizations, it may be where we're heading. I think it's the only solution to flourishing in the age of unpredictability. Thanks very much. Over to Kira and questions.
Thank you, Margaret. Well, I just sort out my camera and just would like to thank you. That was absolutely amazing. It's Jackie speaking. I found myself smiling throughout, and what I really like the idea is that Margaret Heffernan is the collector of beautiful experiments. That's really lovely. Thank you. The thing that really resonated for me was the idea that we're in a period of explosive learning and that leaders can invite ideas and create the space for shared learning. And I'd like to kick us off, please, if I might, with a question around how you would design an MBA program that was intended to educate managers for the responsibility of leadership. What's got to be on that curriculum?
Well, of course, it depends on the nature of the students that you have. I mean, I'm a big believer. This is going to sound a little strange, perhaps. I'm a very big believer in grunt work. I'm a big believer in understanding what's it like in my organization in the crappiest job there is. So I think I'd probably send my students away from campus, go back there to the companies where they worked and try that. Because I think, you know, most people who end up, not everybody obviously, but most people who end up in positions of power come in at quite a nice, tidy, clean level. And they have quite a nice, tidy, clean time. And they rarely, in my experience, I mean, generalizations are always difficult. They rarely understand the whole system. And they even more rarely understand the whole ecosystem on which the organization depends. So I think I'd ask them to spend quite a lot of time there and then think about, if you lived there forever or your livelihood depended on it, how would you want to be managed? So that's not obviously a full program, but I just, it makes me very uncomfortable the way that many business schools, and I don't think Exeter has been guilty of this, but many business schools market themselves as, come here and then you'll be able to get a more highly priced job. In other words, you can skip all the dirty stuff. I think on one, I know on one level, this was a deeply ignorant decision that I made. But I left Cambridge University and started working at the BBC as a dictation typist. I must say, none of my male peers did that. They all went into, all sorts of management trainee programs. And I don't know why I didn't. I mean, I really don't. And if I saw my daughter doing that, I'd kick her. But on the other hand, one of the things that I learned was, as I, got promoted about every 6 months, I knew that organization uphill and down dale. And there were two big advantages. One was nobody could pull the wool over my eyes. They couldn't say, you can't do it like that. Because I'd say, oh, yeah, let me show you. So that was really helpful, right? But the other thing was that I had a very visceral sense of how any decision I made would have this huge ripple effect on all kinds of people and all kinds of lives. And that has really stayed with me. And the abuses of power that perfectly nice people never see, where I was so alert to, partly because, I was quite often on the receiving end of them. So I do, and I write about this in Willful Blindness too. I think the test of a good decision is, can you describe to me the person with the least amount of power, how they're going to experience this decision? And if that sounds okay, then you're probably on the right track. But if you don't even know who they are, or what their concerns are, or what the consequences for them might be, go back to the drawing board.
Lovely, powerful, and reinforcing of much of that message throughout. Thank you.
Great.
One of our early questions was asked that amid the challenges that leaders are facing, that we're all facing, what is your advice on what we can do to hold each other up?
Yeah. Well, I can think of lots of things. I mean, I'm a very big believer in trying to see each other face to face as much as possible within the rules and regs, obviously. I've done, through the pandemic, I did a lot of mentoring of NHS leaders. I set up this, it's one of Margaret's crazy ideas. I set up a huge project with 20 colleagues to mentor 40 NHS leaders. And in many cases, what they would do was they would think of a colleague they hadn't seen for a while and say, well, let's just take a walk around the neighborhood. Really important to do that. And sometimes just around the hospital or where their office had been when they couldn't get in. So as I say, within the rules and regs, I think that's incredibly important. I think it makes a huge difference. As soon as the pandemic started, I drew up a call list of people I know and care about. So I make sure I do something for them every week. Often that was sending them postcards. I just thought, actually, I don't have anything to say. But I want to send them something beautiful, just to say, I'm thinking of you, and here's something beautiful to, lighten your day or bring something different into it, unexpected. And one of the things that was really lovely about that was then I started getting all these beautiful postcards back, and that really improved my day and made me think, wow, this was a really good idea, So I think it's things like that. I also started just phoning friends out of the blue. I thought, oh my God, we have become so anal that we feel we can't talk to somebody unless we schedule an appointment. This is ridiculous. I'm old enough to remember when we just, picked up the phone and called people to say, hi, do you have time for a chat? Not to organize anything, not to make a decision, not to do logistics, just to say, how are you doing? What's going on in your life? So, I think there are other things that you can do if you are going into work at all, because I know some people who still are, kind of having potluck lunches and stuff like that around the table. I mean, thinking of anything social that makes you feel better, probably makes other people feel better, do it with other people. I mean, I think especially going into winter, the crucial thing is thinking about anything that makes me feel good and keeps my mental health pretty buoyant. Do as much of it as you can. So I think that's really important. But I would also say, spend more time with people and get to know them better, right? Spend some time before or after the Zoom call or whatever, just chatting. I know a lot of companies that have had sort of virtual pubs by having a Zoom room open, after hours, where people can bring their glass of wine and just have a good old company gossip, right? That's part of the fun of being in a company. So things like that, I think, make a huge difference. And the more regularly you do it, the more you'll be alert to, somebody, Mary was fine last week and now she seems a bit out of it. And then think about, okay, what can I do to help? Or ask her, what can I do to help? I mean, I was really horrified in the lockdown period when it ended. And I went to see my sister who lives alone. And she'd kind of lost the habit of eye contact. I mean, this is terrible. This is a direct assault on mental health. Eye contact is essential to people's well-being. So what did I do? I went more often. I mean, we live a very long way apart. And I kept positioning myself so she kind of couldn't not make eye contact. So I think, pay attention, show you care, and really notice when people are starting to lose it, because we are going into this second phase with people very burned out. And so they're more fragile. And so they need more support.
Thanks, Margaret. I mean, lots of questions in the chat about burnout, actually, and about mental health in general, but I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction. And so a question here, what advice would you give cynical managers who don't have trust in their organisation? What incremental steps can they take to build trust in their own teams and influence organisations in a positive way, especially when cost cutting might be used as an argument to downplay the human connection?
Well, I think making redundancies is not the point to downplay human connection. It's the point to amplify them. I had a bit of a furious argument with somebody about this yesterday, who said, well, I understand about pushing decisions down to the local level, but you can't do redundancies like that, because you need to have some distance and not see it as human. And I thought, wow, having some distance and not seeing it as human, that led people into gas chambers. Are you out of your mind? I mean, I've made people redundant in ways that, they came up and thanked me, right? Because I was thinking about, who are they? What are the resources that they have? What can we give them, either in the way of references or resources, or, keep their online account going for a couple of months, or, what can we do to make this blow as easy as possible? And what can their colleagues do? And so I think actually thinking of it, any of these decisions as personal, is really important. I'm not a huge fan of scientific management, as you may have gathered, but specifically because I think it has huge weaknesses. But in an age of unpredictability, it's a disaster, because how do you know what the key performance indicator is? Right? I mean, it isn't the same today that it was this time last year. And how do you know what the goals and targets are that are feasible when you don't know what your market's going to do? So I think, scientific management works in very predictable environments. And there, like efficiency, it produces significant advantages. But in a time of huge uncertainty and unpredictability, it traps you in an old model and you won't know till you're drowning. So I think it is really important to, really to think about where is there the most knowledge and sensitivity to where the world is today, and how do we diffuse that? And I'm sorry, because in all that perambulation, I've actually forgotten the question.
I think
so. If you wouldn't mind,
I
try to give a better answer.
I think it's this issue about trust that's at the heart of it. Is that, so much of what you said was about predicated on this sort of trust within organizations, and how in an organization where there is low trust, what can a leader and manager do to build that trust at this time?
Right. So I think, so trust, as my colleague Veronica Paley would say, trust is based on 4 things. Benevolence, do people care about me? Competence, are they actually able to do their job? Consistency, do they apply the same kind of thinking all of the time? And integrity, which is do the same in private that they do in public. So if you work on those 4 aspects, you will help to build trust. But I think what Veronica's model leaves out is that if you really want to trust people to trust you, you have to trust them. And, in my experience running companies, I could say to somebody, I want this done, according to these parameters on this date with all these key KPIs and all this sort of stuff. Or I could say, this needs to be doing, and I trust you to know how to do it. And I have to tell you, unless you have an absolute sociopath working for you, giving people your trust is so much more motivating than metrics can ever be. Because what happens? They've trusted me to do this. I really don't want to let them down. And in my experience, for the most part, what happens is people over-deliver. They do a better job, or they come up with better ways of doing it than I would ever know. It's just like if I ask a carpenter to make something and I specified exactly how, what's the point of having the carpenter, right? I trust people to know their job better than I possibly could, and therefore to know best how to do it. And I have to say, my whole life as a manager, I've basically said, there's a deadline, there's a task, and the rest is up to you. And I don't care when you come into the office, and I don't care when you get it done, as long as you don't let people down. And I have never been disappointed.
Brilliant. That's a brilliant take on it. Thank you, Margaret. Another question there. We've got lots of questions, so we'll see if we can get through a few more of them. What is your take on the move towards stakeholder capitalism? There's a lot of hype on this through the Business Roundtable, World Economic Forum, Harvard Business Review, The Economist, and others. Is this a desired direction of travel? And if so, how can we move from rhetoric to action?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, the FT wrote something recently which was really impressive, showing that the signatories to the Business Roundtable statement were actually more likely to be cited for environmental and labor abuses than companies on average. On the day that statement came out, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, who was the signatory, also got a, $230 million fine for the mis-selling of opioids to the American people. So I'm, as you can probably tell, pretty cynical about these statements. And the companies that I've worked with that really honor the meaning of it, they've been doing it for years. And not because it was fashionable or anybody told them to. It's what they believed in, and it's kept them very successful. So I think, it's a helpful trend to the degree that it's made people think differently. And I think it's a helpful trend if it's made people feel that's a bandwagon I want to jump on. But it has got to be real, because wow, if there's one thing we don't need more of, it's cynicism. And I think, one of the things that was super disappointing about the American Business Roundtable statement is they talked about, the business of society being to serve all Americans. Well, you can't look after the American climate. I'm sorry, it just can't be done, right? So I think they were all trying to be good guys and look like good guys. And I think time will tell if anybody meant it, and if so, who. Because, certainly the data after 1 year, and 1 year is a short period of time in the business cycle, the data from 1 year is really discouraging.
Thanks, Margaret.
Can I pick a question up for you, Margaret? And it's around the whole idea of entrepreneurship and resilience.
Yeah.
So, the question here is around the idea of sustaining new business startups in a time like this, and what some of your thoughts might be around that, I guess, that landscape that the new startup finds itself in right now.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I mean, in Britain, the government talks about entrepreneurship all the time. I don't think it has the faintest idea what it is or how it works. And it's funny because every now and then some poor soul in the Treasury is tasked over the summer to try to do some research into why is America more entrepreneurial than the UK, and sooner or later they end up emailing me. And then I give them some ideas that they really don't like. How do you sustain entrepreneurship? I mean, what's quite interesting is, and of course it depends on the sector. My pals running tech startups are doing fine for the most part. There's quite a lot of investment. The investment community mostly knows that actually if things are slow, it's a good time to pick up companies. I have a friend who sold his company super successfully, actually right through the lockdown, and never actually met the people face to face until it was all over. So, but the other kinds of entrepreneurial startups, because they matter to my mind just as much, they always struggle for funding. I think there's huge value in thinking about how can I use this moment to build closer relationships with my customers. A number of the startups I've worked with, the customers have really designed the product or the service for them. And they've said, you can be anchor tenants, as it were. You can be our early adopters, and we'll give you whatever it is we're doing for free if you will give us honest, thorough, really nitty-gritty feedback. The other thing I would say is sometimes, quite often, bad times are a fantastic time to launch a company. So, Dell and Microsoft were launched in the middle of recessions. I've written quite a lot about an American company called Method Home Care Products. And they had some of the most brilliant positioning I've ever seen. So they thought, well, people are spending more money on their homes, and having a beautiful home is more of a thing. And everybody wants to save the planet. So why is it that people have beautiful homes that they clean with toxic chemicals in bottles that look like garbage, right? So they decided we're going to make non-toxic cleaning materials in beautiful containers that don't harm the planet. Brilliant, brilliant positioning. And they launched pretty much as the American stock market crashed in 2001. They funded the whole thing with credit cards. And what they discovered was, their positioning was dependent on fantastic industrial designs for the containers. And the world's top industrial designers were willing to work with them because they didn't have a very full book of work. And whereas in the past, they would probably never have had an answer to their email, actually, they got to work with some of the best designers in the world. And they discovered retailers didn't have any new products anywhere because everybody had pulled their horns in. So they got into major big box retailers in the US because they just wanted something new and cool to offer to their customers. So I think it's really worth thinking about, who are the people we'd always dream of working with, and give it a go. That's what entrepreneurs do anyway, right? Or who are the people we always would just love to have on our board? Maybe they'll say yes. I mean, an email doesn't cost even a stamp, right? So I think, be more ambitious, because I think, the instinct is hunker down. But I think it's the wrong instinct. I think be bold. And that's how you get ahead of the big guys, right? So with Method, in some categories, within less than 5 years, in some categories, they were beating Procter & Gamble. I mean, that's an amazing thing.
Thank you. That's great. Great ideas coming through. Some wonderful themes about relationships, empathy, compassion, connection. They're just beautiful ideas. Thank you. I just want to pick up.
Thank you.
Lovely. A question here. The pandemic has in many ways deepened inequalities in society. And the question poses, how can leaders in corporations help to reduce this inequality gap?
Well, I mean, obviously they could do it by hiring differently. I mean, we've been working the diversity problem for so long, it's ridiculous. And there was a very interesting study out from McKinsey earlier this week showing in the last 10 years, we've got almost nowhere. I mean, infinitesimal gains. And, the way I think about this is pretty simple, which is businesses generally get done what need to get done. So just stop messing around and decide that by the end of the year, we're going to, in terms of new hires, we're going to have a more diverse organization. In terms of promotion, we're going to have a more diverse organization, and then do that again next year and the year after and the year after and the year after that. You can get there. This is not insoluble, but you have to decide you're going to do it. I mean, I do think there are many, many complex, really systemic issues around diversity. But you have, I think companies have a huge opportunity to change that. And I don't think they can do it all. I don't think they can do it alone. But if you're a hiring manager, you have a choice. And you have to say, we've got to have a short list that have women on them. They have Asian people on them. They have Black people on them. They have disabled people on them. We've got to get there. And I'm not interviewing if you can't give me that list. That's it. That's it. So, it's like, oh, come on. Come on. And, you're not hiring because you're laying people off, right? Look at how you're promoting people. I remember doing some work with Nike. Nike has lots of women in it. But the important thing is you have to map where they are. And I used to do this with lots of companies. It's always the same diagram. It's a flipping iceberg, right? Which is they're all at the bottom. And maybe there's one or two at the top. In the case of Nike, I think at the time, the two women who were maybe in the senior leadership team, neither of them had families. And so all the young women in Nike looked at that and thought, well, it's going to be a choice. I'm going to have a family and not get there, or I need to leave. I mean, equally, I did some work for an investment bank that must remain nameless. And I remember they had done a very good job in having the recruitment 50-50 in terms of men and women. And then they complained that, eventually lots of women left and they thought it was all babies. And then they did the research, God bless them, and discovered, no, it wasn't all babies. They really objected to the requirement that they be available 3 weekends out of 4 for, intense M&A work, which is almost always done overnight, over the weekends, that kind of stuff. So think about that for a second. This is a math problem. If you need that amount of coverage, then actually what you need is more people. right? You need more people so that you can say you only have to be available 1 weekend out of 4, which is kind of okay. So I said that, I thought, this is not, you guys are supposed to be the smartest guys in the universe. And this isn't even algebra. It's just math. And they said, oh, but then we'd have to split the bonus pot across more people. So that's just a choice. Either you want the diversity or you want the money. And they just chose the money. So maybe it's time to revisit that decision. Because I really do think, first of all, everybody thinks this is political correctness. My MP, Jacob Rees-Mogg, talks about being enslaved by political correctness, which is a deeply offensive use of language. But it has nothing to do with political correctness. If you want to be in touch with the world that you serve, it better be inside your organization. That's it. You want to make good decisions that make sense to people, that they can understand and think are fair? Make them with those people.
Yeah.
It's about being effective, and it's about being legitimate. And I think everybody recognizes we're in a pretty tense moment right now, where it's hard to see legitimate sources of power. And I think having that question of legitimacy front of mind is really important.
So just building on that, just thinking about that, we've got a question from somebody, Margaret, who is looking for advice in that sort of terrain. What advice would you give to younger employees on how they can be more visible and build networks in this environment?
Well, I mean, obviously at the moment, being visible is pretty tough, right? I think a lot of it's around, volunteering for projects. I think some of it is, this is going to sound very trivial, but I don't think it is. It's about actually looking memorable. And the reason I say that is because I remember speaking at an event at the Women's Network in London Business School. And I looked across, this sea of women. And honest to God, they all looked exactly the same. They're all wearing black suits. They all had helmet hair. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to fit in. And the consequence of that was they didn't stand out. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody run away, and dye their hair blue. But I am saying, think about what you want people to see when they see you. Think about, how do I add to what's being said in the conversation? Don't ever apologize. I mean, I saw a senior woman I admire enormously kick off a presentation the other day by saying she was intimidated by the room. Don't say that. You don't have to be intimidated. You're smart. You're committed. Get on with it. I think the other thing is, I think it's very important, and there's a great book on this subject. It's very important to be helpful. And I don't say that in the handmaiden sense. I mean, seeing a problem and moving towards it before it explodes to say, can I help? And there is a fantastic book on this subject. And anytime anybody asks me, what business book do you really like? This is it. It's a book called Give and Take by Adam Grant. And Adam is at the Wharton School of Business, which is famous for being full of quants who know the value of nothing and just the cost of everything, right? So it's a very unlikely book to come out of Wharton. And it is a brilliant, convincing, case-closed argument that the people who do best in life are generous. Now, they're not mindlessly generous. They're pretty good after they've been generous at being able to distinguish between the takers and, and the good citizens. But they're generous and they're helpful. And bear in mind that, the late Richard Hackman's research on, what makes outstanding organizations is helpfulness. Bear in mind the research that tried to analyze what made Bell Lab the most productive lab in human history was helpfulness. This stuff really matters. And when people help you, you will never forget them. And, on a slightly less lofty tone, I can remember sitting with a colleague of mine talking about the kind of year that we'd had and why it had been, and we both had very good years from a business perspective, and wondering why. And the only thing we could come up with is that both of us, independently, have a sort of habit of paying quite a lot of attention to junior people. And when we thought about it, all of our best opportunities had come from them. Not by brown-nosing, the higher-ups, but by paying attention to younger people and helping them where we could. And when they were in a room where they said, how can we do X, Y, or Z? They said, well, Margaret's really good at this, or Sandra's really good at this. So, I think Adam's nailed it. I take my hat off to him. It's a brilliant argument. And I defy anybody to argue with it.
So this is, as I said at the outset, this is the first of our Leading Edge series. And it would be great if we've had a great audience for this afternoon. So do please join us for our next event, which is on the 14th of October. It's part of our Black History Month, a broader programme that our colleague Ollie Young has put together, fantastic programme of events during Black History Month. And we have one during the Leading Edge series on making your way as a Black entrepreneur. We're joined by 3 entrepreneurs, Jabu Butera from Plymouth, Erica Brodnock and Pavita Cooper, chaired by Brenda Imanis, who's a BBC journalist. So it's one to look out for. And there's a link that's just popped up on your screens there. So do join us for that event. Our other 2 leading edge events this year, we have Henry Timms, who grew up in Exeter, but he now runs the Lincoln Centre for the Performing Arts in New York, one of the largest performing arts venues in the world. So it'll be great to hear from Henry, from his journey from Exeter to New York. And then in December, we have a very special event with John Amici, the respected organizational psychologist, best-selling New York Times author, general great person, fantastic speaker, and we're looking forward to hearing from John in December. So do please look out for those. While Margaret's not here with us, and hopefully she'll come back in a second, I will give a plug for her book, Uncharted, which is available from Waterstones online. It's available from Blackwell's Bookshop on campus, from local independent booksellers like the Crediton Community Bookshop here in Devon, and from your university and public libraries. So do check out her book. It is a terrific read, really worth digging into. So Jackie, are there any final comments from you?
Well, first, I'm in absolute awe of Margaret Heffernan and her ability to speak. So I think if she's collapsed in the heap to the side, she deserves that rest. That was truly amazing. Some of those key messages were heartfelt and serve as a real inspiration. And we want to continue the conversation. We're keen to hear your feedback and how we can bring the leaders that you're interested in hearing. You can reach us on Twitter and LinkedIn by using @the Exeter MBA. Let's keep this going. We'll invite Margaret into those conversations too. And a reminder that the recording of today's session with all the clunky bits can be found on the Leading Edge website. And make sure that you share them with your teams and your networks. Let's get those big ideas out there. Kira, thank you so much for kicking us off. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Jackie. And just to say, we will pass on your thanks. So many good thanks and praise for Margaret coming through on the chat. So we will pass that on to Margaret. It's a shame that she's just left us at the last minute, but we got the bulk of what she was saying. And we've had some lovely phrases this afternoon, some great things for all of us to take away. So thank you very much for joining us, and do join Jackie and I for future events in the Leading Edge series. Thank you.